Page 3. Antonio Dadabo. The Steefotogrammetric Survey. Online audiobook with text written in Italian and read in English. After 40 years, we want to remember the intervention in Basilicata of the photogrammetric unit of the Urban Police of Bari with the online publication of the book. Printed in 1983 by Levante Editor of Bari, which illustrates the technique used in the survey of damaged monuments since the 1980 earthquake.
Presentation. Professor Antonio Dadabo is stabilized in charge of architectural photogrammetry, a chair which, starting from the academic year 1982-83, has been aggregated to the Drawing Institute of the Engineering Faculty of Bari. In alignment with the current didactic scientific orientations that emerged in recent conferences, national teachers of the disciplines of representation in the faculties of architecture and engineering. This work is part of a series of studies, a compendium of research that has matured over the years, for the sector of architectural relief and its graphic reduction, starting from the geometric foundations of the representation to which the techniques of use of the special shooting equipment refer. Stereophotogrammetric automatic return and orthophotography. From the first contacts I had with my younger colleague, I was able to realize his remarkable scientific preparation, made even more evident by the determination and passion shown by him in dedicating himself to the study of the complex matter and the experiences that he was constantly developing. Above all, the results he obtained in teaching appeared surprising, demonstrated by the total involvement of his students, whom I found interested beyond the usual limits in real episodes of thematic research. Equally peculiar were some of his proposals, conveniently illustrated to me, regarding the use of photogrammetric surveying techniques not only in urban planning, architectural design or restoration even when in that phase, extremely delicate, relating to the analysis of the possibilities of insertion set the buildings, procedures all related to representation, regardless of the means used to render it. I also remember his interventions in the earthquake-stricken areas of Basilicata in the winter of 1980. With the assistance of the photogrammetric unit of the Bari Traffic Police, previously trained by him for very different tasks, although basically aimed at the production of urban environmental documentation. Thanks to this commitment, the Drawing Institute is currently the custodian of 1,500 stereometric frames, partially returned, which are, in all probability, the only document available on the monuments of those areas, too hastily flattened by the bulldozer, in the frenetic and chaotic ferment of initiatives that took place in those days. Pages 6 and 7. With the essential collaboration of Professor Dadabo, in June 1982, had the opportunity to organize a seminar on the theme of the Census and Catalogue of Cultural Heritage, keeping an eye on the Apulian situation, which is unfortunately affected by the lack of effective coordination at a scientific level. The most important consequence of the seminar in question was that, relating to the concrete procedural start for the establishment of an interdepartmental documentation center aimed at this purpose, with the involvement of other disciplinary sectors such as that of the history of art, archaeology and pre-classic civilizations and classics, popular traditions, linguistic expressions, aesthetics, philology, history, economic geography and sociology. At the basis of such an expansion of scientific skills in documentary research, there was the common belief about the need to reach the knowledge of a specific cultural asset by producing a complete range of data capable of allowing its exact identification in the context of belonging. In truth, the speech in question started from many other points discussed at length with Antonio Dadabo. As far as the problem of the documentation of the building is concerned, in fact, the purpose to which the representative graph of the survey is aimed is of considerable importance. There can be different aspects of the same building, and the environmental situations that refer to it can be different. Equally differentiated, therefore, it must be the graphic language to be used in the representation. Therefore, without denying the effectiveness of a graphic sign moved by the expressive ability of the individual in free adoption of representative means, it is essential to arrive at the reorganization and unification of all the complex symbology that is commonly used as soon as possible. In particular, the suggestion of the CIPA. In this regard, without prejudice, of course, every possibility relating to the use of particular conventional signs which, over time, have traditionally established themselves in the various regions. In this perspective, I hope that the work produced by Professor Dadabo can represent an effective contribution to the knowledge of the problems of architectural photogrammetry, which are closely connected and complementary to those of the representation and documentation of the building. Professor Engineer Gaetano Farno, Director of the Drawing Institute of the Faculty of Engineering of Bari. Introduction. I decided to start this volume with the prolusion of the engineer Professor Raffaele De Vita, held at the first seminar of architectural photogrammetry, which took place at our faculty in 1974, not only to pay homage to his memory, but also for the presumptuous will to relaunch a seed that has brought unexpected fruit to date. The first research, carried out in Bari on architectural photogrammetry, dates back to 1963, when on the initiative of the engineer Professor Achille Petrignani, Director of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Planning of the local Faculty of Engineering, the stereophotogrammetric section was established for the survey of monuments and of urban environments. The section, entrusted to De Vita, was equipped with Wild P30 shooting equipment and a Wild A2 universal restitutor. Among the first reliefs, carried out in full respect of the canons of the topography, we must remember those of the Church of Santa Maria di Saponto and of the main facade of the Basilica of San Nicola in Bari. Voluntary assistant of De Vita. At the technical architecture course, I joined the stereophotogrammetric section in 1966, driven by the desire to use in architectural design more photography than topographical relief. The first reliefs in which I participated were those relating to the castle of Conversano and to the main facade of the Cathedral of Altamura. The long focal length of the recording equipment we had always required the integration of the photogrammetric survey with the traditional one, obtained by means of a metric tape. The continuous comparison between the two methods, made by those who had always resorted to the traditional one, led to a new but not orthodox treatment of the stereoscopic model. For example, in the restitution of the elevations of the castle of Conversano, absolute priority was given to the finalization, although the resumption of an elevation allowed the total automation of the drawing. This was carried out in the traditional way and considering the autograph as a simple country notebook. For the need not to distract attention from the graph, which had to contain the amount of data necessary and sufficient for a clear and unequivocal reading, the shooting method itself was slowly changed. Speed was preferred to precision, which was always more than superfluous for construction works. Caption. The relief of the main facade of the Basilica of San Nicola in Bari and the plans, planimetric and altimetric. Shooting with Wild P30 photodiode. The first headquarters of the stereophotogrammetric section for the survey of monuments and urban environments. Located at the old headquarters of the engineering faculty on the second floor of the Bari Chamber of Commerce. In the photo, Professor Raffaele De Vita and engineer Domenico de Salvia verify the return model obtained with the Wild A2 autograph. Page 9. The survey of the control points and a base, which made with theodolite, absorbed 90% of the shooting time, was replaced by the direct survey with the metric tape contemporary or deferred over time, or by the insertion of staffs or other known elements in the picture. It was even considered the opportunity to carry out surveys of reports with values of the base distance ratio lower than the minimum allowed. De Vita's participation in the works, which took place in 1968 in Saint-Mandé, France, for the establishment of the CIPA, Comité l'International de Photogrammetrie Architecturale, and in the international conferences that followed, directed our research towards the problem of finalization, too often placed in the background and which was at the center of the report. Reported below, read by De Vita himself at the International Symposium on the Photogrammetry of Monuments, held in Lucca in September 1973. Caption. Professor De Vita engaged in surveying the checkpoints. The recovery involved 4 phases. Measurement of the control data with the theodolite at the point station on the left. Snap of the left frame, changed station and snap of the right frame. Measurement of the control data with theodolite at the point station on the right. Adjustment of the inverse staff at the left station point and relief of the base with theodolite. The metric chamber of the Wild P30 phototheodolite, built for terrestrial surveys. Great distance and, therefore, from elevated positions, it forced to make almost all the shots within urban centers, from the terraces of the buildings, with considerable inconvenience and increase in technical times. The long recovery times had made the integration of the shooting equipment mandatory with an umbrella of a size such as to protect the instrument from the sun or sudden rain showers. In the photo, a moment of the relief of the side facade of the Cathedral of Altamura. The resumption of the main portal of the Cathedral of Altamura, which began with the sun and ended in the rain. In the whole, the engineer de Salvia engaged in survey of control points. Page 10 and 11. Caption. The first international meeting on photogrammetry at the service of architecture was organized by ICOMOS in Saint-Mandé, France, on the 4th to the 6th of July 1968. In it, after an overview of the possibilities of photogrammetry made by Maurice Carbonel, the problem of relief was addressed in light of the needs of the architects and those responsible for the protection of monuments, illustrated by the reports of J. P. Paquet, A. De Vita, A. J. Donze, M. Jurnik, R. W. M. C. Dowell, C. Eda and J. Gomolashevsky. A few days later, the same problem was addressed at the 11th Congress of the International Photogrammetry Society (ISP), which was held in Lausanne, Switzerland, on the 8th to the 20th of July 1968. Following these meetings, the 2 international organizations decided to set up an International Architectural Photogrammetry Committee, which met for the first time in Paris on 18 and 19 June 1970. In March 1972, on the initiative of CIPA, the first international course of architectural photogrammetry was organized, which probably was not taken into due consideration in Italy, given that in addition to myself there was only one other Italian, the architect Cesare Candari, currently professor of descriptive geometry at the Faculty of Architecture in Rome. Carried out at the Federal Polytechnic of Zurich, the course clearly defined the characteristics of architectural photogrammetry, clearly differentiating it from the other branches of photogrammetry, such as that treated in topography or that in training of medicine, where the engineer Maurice Carbonel, president of CIPA, he hoped for the advent of medical photogrammeters. In the second international course of architectural photogrammetry, organized in May 1975 at Waldheerbrugg, Switzerland, we heard, probably for the first time between photogrammeters, of the possible use of cameras 24 by 35 mm format in the relief. The future location in Italy of the new discipline was also emerging. Among the 5 Italians taking part in the second course, in addition to myself and the architect Cundari, were Professor Rosario Filosto and engineer Michele Incerillo from the Institute of Design of the Faculty of Engineering of Palermo, where an urban architectural photogrammetric archive of Western Sicily had been started with the use of a wild C120 stereometric chamber. The Chair of Restoration of Monuments, directed by Professor Roberto Di Stefano and in which Cesare Cundari worked, had already equipped itself with wild C120 stereometric chamber and wild A40 restitutor, while other faculties of architecture were preparing to use photogrammetry directly. In Bari, after the sudden disappearance of Professor De Vita in the summer of 1974, the photogrammetric spacecraft ran the risk of drifting in a stormy sea and passed under the tutelage of the Chair of Architecture and Architectural Composition, directed by the architect Professor Vittorio Chia, until the activation of the course of photogrammetric techniques applied to urban planning and architecture, which took place in the academic year 1976-77 and of which I got the teaching assignment. In the study plan, the 6-month course was included. In the 3rd year, among the asterisk subjects of the architecture address and among the subjects a choice of the territorial structure address, both belonging to the course degree in civil construction engineering. The interest that photogrammetry had aroused among the students of the course of architecture and architectural composition and the assistant activity, which I had carried out at the same chair, encouraged me in an attempt to bring photogrammetry among the design methods, rather than among the notable ones. In the first years of activity of the chair, the works carried out by the students, exhibited in specially organized exhibitions, had as a central topic the design of the restoration through direct intervention on the photographic model. Captions: the stereophotogrammetric survey of an elevation of the Church of Santa Maria di Saponto. The return in 1/20 scale of the main portal of the Basilica of San Nicola in Bari is one of the first continuous returns made at the stereophotogrammetric section of Bari, with the autograph Wild A2. In 1975, in the photographic exhibition organized at the university campus, the students reserved a section for photogrammetry, in front of which we see the magnificent rector, Professor Ernesto Quariello, and the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering, Professor Vincenzo Cotecchia. Page 14. In 1979 a degree thesis was carried out on the use of reverse photogrammetry in the recovery of the existing building heritage, but probably at the time was not ripe for such a leap, which only caused disappointment among the students and forms of friction with other disciplines. The shortage of equipment was compensated by external aid, provided essentially by Wild Italia SPA, which, at the end of the first year, financed the purchase of 2 stereoscopes and a travel stay in Switzerland for all course participants, with a visit at the Wild Heerbrugg plants and at the School of Photogrammetry of St. Gallen. In 1978 he made available complete equipment, a recording and return, including a Wild C120 stereometric chamber and a Wild A40 autograph. In the following years, the C120 was purchased with funds from the Ministry of Education, while the A40 remained available for free for teaching and research purposes, thanks to a loan contract stipulated between the University of Bari and Wild Italy itself. The temporary availability of all transportable equipment produced by Wild Heerbrugg was not lacking, thanks to the enthusiasm with which the Città Tommaso Avallone, responsible for Wild for southern Italy, followed the activity of the chair. With the contribution of the National Research Council, in addition to research on the types and construction features of military architecture in the Bari area through scientific survey with photogrammetric methods. Directed by Professor De Vita in 1971 after the activation of the course problems related to establishment of a database of urban environments and buildings of considerable urban and architectural interest in 1978. Technical and legal economic validity of short-distance photogrammetry in 1979. Legislation and photogrammetric survey models of historic centers and monumental buildings in the context of the project aimed at sciences for the conservation and enhancement of cultural heritage. GE in 1980. Caption. Right. The first exhibition of architectural photogrammetry organized by students at the end of the course in May 1977 in the first drawing room of the Faculty of Engineering. The sector reserved for students' works in the National Exhibition of Architectural Photogrammetry, which took place in Bari in May 1978. Right. An example of an intervention on the photographic image to visualize the restoration project, where the building is shown in its current state and in a hypothetical reconstruction obtainable on the basis of an ancient document. Page 16. Caption. The interest of the press for the activity of the architectural photogrammetry of Bari. Left. Some headlines that appeared in newspapers. Right. A third-page article from the Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno on January 16, 1976. Page 18. On the occasion of these researches, the following were carried out. Surveys in Matera in the Rione Sassi, in collaboration with undergraduates in monument restoration of the Faculty of Architecture in Florence. In Florence, in collaboration with Professor Walter Ferri and the Superintendency of Monuments. In Venice, in collaboration with the architect Nicola Randolfi, the municipality and the chair of aerial photogrammetry and cartographic representation of the local Faculty of Architecture. All didactic and research activities were carried out in an osmotic relationship with the forces operating in the area. Obtained through the organization of refresher courses, seminars and conferences both local and national. In 1977, the Roundtable on the Protection of Cultural Heritage and the Photogrammetry course applied to the detection of road accidents, the latter reserved for the traffic police of the province of Bari. Captions. The first shots with the Wild C120 stereometric camera were made in 1977, in the courtyard of the Castle of Barletta, whose survey was completed in just over an hour with a single central station and 8 shots, of which 4 orthogonal to the sides of the courtyard and 4 according to the diagonals. In the photo, from left the engineer Maurizio Minceli, the writer, the engineer Professor Marcello Grazzotti, director of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Planning, and the engineer Renato Cervini. The jury examines the works displayed for the award of the prize with which Wild Italia intended to remember the figure of the late Professor De Vita. In the photo, from left, Mrs. Margherita De Vita, the architect Professor Vittorio Chia, the Professor Vincenzo Cotecchia, Dean of the Engineering Faculty. The participants in the first course of photogrammetric techniques pose for a souvenir photo after the very welcome news given by the director of Wild Italia, Dr. Francesco Franceschi, of the ex equo awarding of the prize in the memory of Professor De Vita, for which all will participate study trip to Switzerland. Right. An article published in Avenir of the 23rd of June 1977. Page 20. In 1978, the photogrammetry course for the Carabinieri Command of Bari. The seminar on legal problems of photogrammetry attended by numerous magistrates of the Court of Bari. And the National Conference of Architectural Photogrammetry. In 1979. the refresher course on photography and photogrammetry for teachers of schools of all levels. Organized in collaboration with the school museum environment sector of the local Provveditorato al Studi, and the Round Table on Methods and Tools for the Management of Cultural Heritage proposed for the establishment of the regional database. In 1980, the collaboration at the National Convention on the Museum of the Object Today, Structure and Function organized by the Museum of Rural Life in San Michele di Bari, and following the earthquake of the 23rd of November, the organization of the campaign of reliefs of some monuments of Basilicata, executed by the photogrammetric unit of the urban police of Bari, which in the meantime had been established on the initiative of Dr. Antonio Cavallo, deputy commander of the Corps. Captions. Often the theme of the year, created by the students, was an opportunity to contest planning interventions on the city. The example shown here concerns a modern building built on the wall of the historic center of Bari and multiplied by photomontage to determine a concrete waterfall. On the right, an article from La Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno, dated the 14th of December 1980. Page 22 and 23. In 1981, the Conference on Photogrammetry and Protection of the Territory, on the occasion of which, in the margins of the exhibition of the surveys carried out in the areas affected by the earthquake, a photogrammetry laboratory was set up equipped for short-distance shooting and restitution. The conference had been organized in collaboration with the culture departments of the municipality and the province and with the vice presidency of the Puglia region, which, for the management of the laboratory, had made available the staff specialized in photogrammetry of the project for the census and cataloguing of the trulli of the LTII Valley. Captions. A 3 by 3 by 3 meters cube. It was reported on the stereometric pair of frames with the reverse photogrammetry method, in a predetermined position on the planimetric and altimetric restitution of the same frames. On the right, two articles of La Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno of the 11th of November 81 and the 25th of May 81. Pages 24 and 25. In 1982, following the publication in the official Gazette of the change of denomination of the discipline from photogrammetric techniques applied to urban planning and architecture in architectural photogrammetry, I asked and obtained from the Degree Course Council in Civil Engineering the transfer, then ratified by the Faculty Council, of the discipline in question, from the Institute of Architecture and Urban Planning to the Institute of Design of the same faculty, as it is now clearly part of the representation area. In reporting in this volume the results of the experiences gained over the years, I wish to thank those who participated in the debate with sincerity and breadth of views and, in particular, the students who often made me rethink the phrase pronounced by a saint, "Give me a handful of young people and do miracles." Colonel Antonio Cavallo, Deputy Commander of the Bari City Police Department, and Dr. Leonardo Ranella, Deputy Prosecutor of the Republic, which deserves the merit and the courage of having sprouted the photogrammetric seed in a soil which, up to now, in Italy, had proved to be adverse. The architect Professor Cesare Cundari and the engineer Professor Walter Ferri, who have always guaranteed their contribution as photogrammeter architect and photogrammeter topographer. The Savant Tommaso Avallone, who with his enthusiasm has always made the necessary equipment available right up to the waters of the Venice Lagoon. Antonio D'Adabo. On the right, an article from La Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno of the 17th of June 81. On the left, a diagram indicating the number of students participating in the seminars L974-1976 and in the architectural photogrammetry course. The dotted line refers to students who had the discipline in their study plan. On the right, an article from La Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno, dated June 17, 1981. On the left, a diagram indicating the number of students participating in the seminars 1974 to 1976 and in the architectural photogrammetry course. The dotted line refers to students who had the discipline in their study plan. Page 26 to 27. Some posters relating to events of the period 1975–1978. Note at the bottom left appointment with photogrammetry, a radio program designed by a student and broadcast by a local radio. Page 27. Prolusion held by the engineer Professor Raffaele de Vita at the first seminar of architectural photogrammetry, which took place at the engineering faculty of Bari in February 1974. Historical background of the survey. The graphic representation in its various forms, from ancient times through mural graffiti, today in the manifold varieties regards the use of the materials used and the techniques used, and understood in the most general sense, as an expression of thought in various aspects ranging from cultural to social to human. In particular, there is the light of the representation of a project related to its knowledge, which will be all the more complete the more comprehensive and detailed his representation has been. This will also be more objective and therefore effective, if it does not take place within a two-way relationship between object and subject that identifies it graphically, and therefore influenced by personal interpretations, but between object and reader, extraneous to the phases of its graphicization. An angle in itself of unlimited interest that acquires particular value when it is brought into the perspective of knowledge of the architectural heritage. Hence the opportunity to examine what has been the development of the forms of representation and its evolution over time. Also in relation to the identification of the modification of the architectural ones. In deepening the research in this specific case and going into ancient times, there is no doubt that there was a graphic representation before the execution of a work. This can be said even if all the drawing heritage of the ancient Eastern and Mediterranean civilizations has been inexorably lost. One thinks that even if only in the mind of those designers, there had to be a clear graphic concept of what they were doing. If today we find such rigorous geometric relationships existing in the pyramids, or in Greek temples, or finally in the sequences of spaces of Roman monuments. Page 28. During these civilizations, and even more than the Egyptian one, the temple to assume the well-known importance that it had among those peoples. It required compliance with precise orientation rules, dimensional ratios and hierarchical proportions. Therefore it must be thought that not only drawings but also models and reproductions of details will have been carried out. A confirmation comes to us in a certain way, meaning from the wide range of pictorial and sculptural representations performed for magical religious purposes in Eastern civilizations, where there are figures, especially in plastic models, buildings and houses. Among these are the Mesopotamical clay tablets representing entire urban complexes or camps, which can be considered the premises of what we will then call relief of architectural works. In fact, when we admit the existence of graphic representations for design purposes through the verification of reproductions of ancient works, we have indirectly set up a closed-loop relationship between design and execution and between execution and design of the relief. Continuing to fix some dates of this graphic development related to architecture, we overlook the Greek world, and we find that, following the crisis of the 11th and 10th centuries BC, any figurative form of representation is lost. This will reappear only with the Hellenistic era, with the rise of the landscape relief, the lack of magical religious representation, male based on the micrometals of Egyptian and Mesopotamic cultures. Perhaps due to the secularization process of the Greek one, cannot completely rule out the lack of representation. Just remember Hippodamus from Leto, 5th century BC, who as the first urban planner provides for the construction of new cities such as Miletus, Rhodes, Piraeus, Turi, complexes that to be made up of right-angled crossing arteries, as well as well-defined squares and open spaces. They cannot disregard a precise and well-defined graphic representation for each floor. At the end of this century, however, a work is found in which a city is depicted. This is Troy, which is shown in perspective from above, in the bas-relief included in the funeral monument of a prince of Asia Minor, the Heron of Golbashi Trv Sat. But it is not the only one. Similar forms reappear in other representations of the same period or a little later. Then found in Lycia. Page 29. Basically the reasons already found in the previous works are repeated. Figurations when they are of cities or landscapes. They are seen in perspective from above like a bird's eye view. This setting will continue for a long time to come. And if on the one hand it is a prelude, raising the point of view more and more, for the top view to the figuration in the plan, on the other hand, it will encourage the study of the rules of perspective. And finally to those of representation on a plane. Examples of cities and landscapes seen in oblique perspective can be found in all wall painting of the Roman period, starting from the 1st century BC, already in the Barberini mosaic of Palestrina, around the first half of the 2nd century BC. A broad perspective view of the Nile Valley is visible. Nor are there any coins of the imperial age, which shows buildings or cities in perspective from above. Also to be remembered is the representation of a Mesopotamical city, always seen from above, in the Arch of Septimius Severus and in the Tabulae Illici, partly in the Capitoline museums, where the point of view is even higher. Finally, there are similar representations in later works, as in the Trajan's column and in the Constantine area. Also in miniatures of both ancient and Byzantine codes, in the Roman Vatican Virgil, in the Ambrosian Iliad, then in some mosaics of the Roman and Ravenna Church. It is not only in the confirmation of these representations obtained from life, through painting and sculpture, that the demonstration of an activity ends, which subsequently over time is transformed into methodological processes. Even from literary sources we have precise information on graphic design, and on buildings that were the subject of graphics. Vitruvius, speaking of the skills of an architect, says, Graphidus scientiam habere quo facilis exemplaribus pictus quam velit speciem deform valli I 1-4. And Suetonius claims that Caesar had examined a school project for gladiators. Formum quae ludum gladiatorum erat edificaturus in Davitus as eram 31. And again Orlogethlio in the notes Act C. 19. X. 2. tells of having visited Cornelio Frontone when several architects were around him to show him reliefs and drawings of term executed on parchment. Page 30. But the most surprising demonstration of a graphic transfer, no more than a work to be performed, but of a work carried out, or rather a building complex, we find it from the large marble plan of ancient Rome, called the Forma Urbis. This is the largest relief known today, probably born with the intention of magnifying the glory of Rome, through a grandiose vision of the location of its monuments and the entire extent of the city, and which is above all a testimony to the need to graph an architectural reality. The ensemble consisting of marble slabs, measuring approximately 13 by 18 meters, was placed on a wall of the Forum of Peace, probably the library, attributable to the period of Septimius Severus 145 to 211 BC. It was carried out with the utmost metric rigor so as to be able to identify the various buildings in their real size without the possibility of errors, as the ratio of 1:240 had been respected, that is, each foot corresponded to 240 in reality. But what strikes us even more is the elaboration of the conventional signs used in plants. A point indicates a tree or a column, a dash indicates a pillar, and a V between two walls a staircase. Although of lesser extent, no less important in order to indicate a relief, other representations on marble slabs are to be remembered. According to a scholar, Gatti, these known to us are the cadastral plants of ancient Erasio, now orange, dated 77 BC, of the Vespasian age, probably for administrative use. A fragment with planimetric representation of buildings, discovered at Via Labicana in 1890, not well identified. The so-called Urbino map. A slab with 3 buildings, preserved in the Museum of Perugia, and dated to the Claudio period. A fragment with the indication of mostly tabernae buildings, lined up along a road. Blank. Page 31. Finally, the remains of a polychrome mosaic discovered in 182 in Via di Porta San Lorenzo, where the plan of a building with several communicating rooms is identified and each marked with a number. The interest in the representation of architectural works expires with the end of the Roman period and has not applied for many centuries. It is necessary to wait until the 15th century for man to awaken and, paying attention to classical culture, find the reasons for studying also for the monuments, and make it, as it will happen in the 16th century, the essential prerequisite for all art. Nevertheless, some episodic examples remain, albeit isolated. In a mosaic of Santa Paulina Nuovo in Ravenna, 6th century, you can admire the reproduction of the Teodorico Palace, which was later destroyed. The reproduction is very correct, and the prospect presented in it, albeit in initiative forms, is very close to the orthogonal representation. Another case comes from painting and can in a certain sense be understood as a relief. This is Giotto's fresco in the upper church of Assisi, late 13th century, in which Saint Francis, honored by a simple man, is depicted. In fact, the most evident subject is the representation of the Roman temple of Minerva, which, albeit in a free interpretation of the great painter, gives way to the use of ancient monumentality as the background of paintings from the 500 onwards. In fact, the interest in ancient monuments dates back to the Renaissance on the initiative of Florentine artists, in particular architects, sculptors, painters, who went mainly to Rome and took over the best-known monuments of classical antiquity. In truth, nothing was done for the purpose of restoration, and the reliefs themselves only partially affect the architecture and art of the Renaissance in general, which developed only in the sense of a historical continuity coherent with the past, without being a stylistic perpetuation. The destroyed works remained such, and in some cases they became stone quarries for the erection of new monuments. Nor were those same remains used to elevate buildings that could be called reconstructions of the old ones. Pag. 32. The architectural relief takes on different expressions and purposes according to the various artists of the time. It became a popular work with Andrea Palladio, who with the 4 books of architecture made a decisive contribution to the knowledge of the works of art together with the treatises of the time, while Fra Giocondo and Antonio di Danzale the Elder, they used them as educational study notes, and Baldassare Peruzzi and Antonio da San Gallo the Younger as a creative stimulus for their architecture. The design is rendered in essential forms, and even if it is a very formal operation of the authors, it does not lose effectiveness. The representation uses entirely personal methods and therefore not yet subject to the laws that would Gaspar Monge will later regulate it with new principles. But as is known, the deepest interest in the works of the past found wider application in the painting of the 16th century. An interest that was not an end in itself as a creative medium in the backgrounds or second floors of the paintings, but became a wonderful pretext in application of the new rules which had suddenly become known with the emergence of a new science, the prospect. Built at the dawn of the Renaissance by artists and mathematicians, it had even become the purpose of the life of some of them. The initiators were Paolo Uccello, painter, 1397–14, and Piero della Francesca, 1416–1490, also a painter, who in the treatise De Prospectiva Pungenti had set the fundamental principles. Luca Parioli, mathematician, and then Brunelleschi with the elaboration of the perspective tablets, and Leonardo with the well-known studies. The use of painting architectures in the backgrounds becomes a fact common to all artists who base the results of their work on the effects of monumentality reported. Among the many Masolino da Panicale in the Brancacci Chapel in Santo Spirito in Florence, Piero della Francesca in the Pala Bradiance, Domenico Ghirlandaio in the Funeral of Santo Stefano in the Cathedral of Prato, Botticelli in the Punishment of Cor Dathan and Addison in the Sistine Chapel, and again Raphael with the Bramantesque architecture, the Mantegna, and later Veronese with the Palladian references. Blank. Page 33. There is no doubt that all the studies on perspective had influence on all the figurative arts. For those of the painters mentioned, to the perspective funds of Carpaccio, to the architectural palaces of Francesco di Giorgio Martini, to the scenes of Sebastiano Serlio, to Piero della Francesca himself, to the compositions by Baldassare Peruzzi, by Fra Giocondo, by Vincenzo Scamozzi. But mainly these perspective rules serve to facilitate the process of graphic representation so much that Gaspar Monge at the end of the 18th century drew from them the formulation of the principles of orthogonal projections, the objective graphic representation of any object, born as a generic representation, and therefore also addressed to the construction sector, therefore became a means of spreading the project graphics and therefore also a method of surveying monuments. The greatest value of these principles is in the transition from drawing to graphic. While the former is a representation, even in orthogonal projection, which maintains an expressive meaning of a precise personality, the latter acquires the property of notation which tends to cancel values. Expressive to acquire characters of extreme and conventional clarity. L. Vanyetti. A quick glance at the centuries following the Renaissance shows us how architectural relief takes on more and more popular meaning. From 600 with Gian Battista Falda and Stefano du Parac we move on to the drawings of Perret, della Mons and Letterale in the 18th century. The first interest in the restoration is from this period, and it is to be thought that the relief may have been influenced by the various trends taking place from the end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 19th. For the restorations, to the Violent Duke, the so-called Romantic one, the one according to Boito, and the historical one. Page 34. Of course, a decisive influence was given by the publication of the so-called Athens Charter 1931, and, as regards Italy, by the issuing of the Restoration Charter, to which Giovannone was not a stranger. The revision of the previous techniques and the formulation of the basis for a scientific restoration of the monuments is due. A criterion which, among other things, was based on its effective and correct execution, on the interpretation of a series of graphs that represented, faithfully, without additions or deductions, the current status of places. The principle enunciated by Vanyetti takes on consistency, which must find application in the graphic rendering of a relief. A tendency towards impersonality is needed. The geometric graphic in plan, elevation and section must have an instrumental function and must increasingly take on the notation characters conventional symbolic. Raffaele da Vita. Blank. Page 35. The purposes of the stereophotogrammetric survey applied to the research on the construction, typological and historical characteristics of certain monuments and sites of Puglia. When the so-called continuous automatic surveyor, after passing a first experimental phase, has imposed itself for some remarkable results of quality and precision, it is necessary to deepen its aims and its meaning. In essence, in order to better assess what the consequences were on the level of cultural and professional reality, it is worth examining the evolution of this method without losing sight of the concept of relief, or rather what is meant by relief. Therefore, through what we might call history of the surveyor, it is effective to observe trends and results obtained in the application of very different methodologies by unknown or known authors, by scholars or other in later times, in reproducing subjects' architectural better buildings on monuments, in particular with regard to the representation of projections on a vertical plane. Therefore, it is enough to scroll through the history of art to realize that in various eras, images of buildings have been reported for various purposes, and to identify a succession of stages that contained the operational process of the survey in a nutshell. Among the first examples are the Maiolica tablets from Knossos, 19th and 18th century BC, which reproduce house facades. In these it is clear the magical religious meaning that is found in similar representations of Eastern civilizations. Evocative or exaltative character instead have the reproductions of some Roman tomb buildings that are sometimes found in the body of the same building, such as the bas-relief inserted in the tomb of the Hatri. Dating back to the Flavian period, the same aspect must very probably be seen in the representation of the Palazzo di Teodorico in Ravenna, which has now disappeared. The central motif of the mosaic created in the church of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo in the same city, 6th century AD. Caption. Report by the engineer Professor Raffaele da Vita at the International Symposium of Photogrammetry of Monuments, which took place in Lucca on the 22nd to the 27th of September 1973, on the occasion of the 18th National Conference of the SIFET. Page 36. Depictions of monuments and houses of Assisi and therefore real relief, reports Giotto. 13th century, in order to historicize the environmental reality around his characters, such as the image of the Temple of Minerva of Assisi and center of the fresco San Francesco honored by a simple man. Subsequently, a documentary interest in the monumental works became evident and gradually accentuated in the 400. So much so that the reproductions of buildings became an integral part of the pictorial compositions, if not a pretext of spatial framework. Remember Fra Angelico, who in his frescoes repeatedly shows the colonnade of the library of the convent of San Marco built by Michelozzo. So also the Mantegna, in whose compositions monuments and ruins of Roman architecture are constantly reproduced. The Arch of Titus is very well recognized, seen from the front, in the background of San Sebastiano, 1472. The Arch of Constantine instead stands out in the center of the Punishment of Cora, Dathan and Abiron, one of the works painted by Botticelli in the Sistine Chapel. It is very interesting to evaluate the pressing documentary aspect, to point out that Ambrogio da Fossano reproduced the facade of the Certosa di Pavia in every detail during the construction, including the scaffolding, 1494 to 1497. But it is certain with the Renaissance that relief, understood in the scientific sense of the procedure, is considered a phenomenon of research and gradually excites architects and artists eager to draw inspiration from classic works, positions and strength for their professional ideas. In this new educational and study formula, the reliefs begin, pushed down to the details and consisting of elevations, plans and sections, from Fra Giocondo to Antonio, from San Gallo il Vecchio and then il Giova, from Palladio to Scamozzi, to Francesco by Giorgio Martini al. p. 37. One of the aspects that denotes the aesthetic taste of the Renaissance, always animated by rationalism and scientific interest, is to use the relief also in a decorative sense. The miniature inserted in an Italian manuscript of the 16th century, preserved in the National Library of Paris, consisting of the Malatesta Temple of Rimini, constitutes a clear index of this phenomenon. In the 17th century, also as a consequence of the spread of printing and engravings, the documentary character of the representation of monuments was accentuated. To remember Stefano Duparac and Gian Battista Falda, the documentary spirit is increased in the 18th and 19th centuries by Perret, Delamonts, Letteralli, Fontana and at the same time, while remaining in the object relief relationship, borders on the figurative by the landscape painters, from Canaletto to Francesco Guardi, to Bellotto and then to Piranesi. At this point, the very particular reliefs for spontaneity and freshness of representation, performed by the travelers or researchers of historical facts or painters who at that time began to travel the streets of Europe and in particular, should not be overlooked. Italy. With the 19th century line, the relief acquires an even more technical meaning, probably in harmony with the design graphics that are mutually generated and in turn generate the building technological development linked to the First Industrial Revolution. It should also be remembered that with the issuance of the principle of conservation of monuments in 1794 by the French National Convention, the interest for the works of the past and for their restoration had awakened, even if freak stylistic interpretations echoed to the theories of Viollet-le-Duc. 1814–18. Page 38. In those days, moreover, there was no lack of well-defined representations on the basis of the already tested rules of Monge, an activity that basically ended up having not absolutely insiders such as Stendhal, Goethe and Byron. The fact is that at the turn of the past century and the present, an interest quite different from the previous ones was born. The study of the monument through its reading, during its reproduction. A more precise point of arrival was subsequently found in Italy with Camillo Boito and Gustavo Giovannoni around the 1920s. 1930s, when the principles of scientific or philological restoration were stated. This, to be essentially centered on the documentation, conservation and consolidation, banned any form of free interpretation and imposed as a consequence a scientific survey. A procedure that is complete and faithful and at the same time an impersonal relationship between the object and its representation and therefore openly and intimately documentary. With the revisionist tendencies of the methodologies of restoration in the 1930s, the pre-existing completely cultural aspects were transformed into the more decidedly professional ones, with a succession of phases. From the approach to the monument during the university education of the future architect to the more finalized one. Almost it means more than a discomfort of inner deepening, which became necessary both during the preparatory planning phase and in the operational restoration phase. Moreover, by definition of the schools of architecture, the relief was to be understood as a restitution in design, and thus the opportunity of a manual operation was confirmed. Also on the basis of colorimetric knowledge, for a necessary and gradual absorption by the student and then the architect, the architectural idea and therefore the architectural form. valid setting, especially if you take into account that the models were, as they still are, the monuments of the past. It is tactful that precisely through this knowledge of the object to be detected, subjective knowledge and objective knowledge was determined in the act of survey, which was certainly one of the key points of the known Charter of Athens 1931. Page 39. Moreover, due to the motives themselves that had determined its thrust, the relief evolved, and from simple epidermal representation it became a complex operation and at the same time coordinated in three-dimensional additions, plans, elevations and sections, as well as in the axonometric spatial representations right up to more intimate details. Operation which, due to its complexity, entailed, as still today, a considerable increase in work, time and cost. It is known that the first applications of the stereophotogrammetric automatic survey opened the hope to this problem above all for the fact that the problems of measuring the height of the monuments were solved, a difficult, dangerous and sometimes impossible operation, even more if they have glimpsed, and now they are noticing, the considerable advantages of reading. When the representation has become spatial, even if the principle of knowledge by points was missing in the small arch at the time of the global impact, albeit rigorously scientific, I dare say aseptic, of the stereophotogrammetric surveyor, with the introduction of means, and in this case of optical mechanical means, it is highlighted that the road now taken, precisely to avoid detachments of cultural awareness, indispensable in the decision-making phase of the conservation of the monumental heritage, must be followed in a particular interdisciplinary atmosphere. In fact, if on one hand through an in-depth knowledge of this new instrumentation the architect, or the user of the surveyor, will realize that the reading of the monument or complex can take place in a more effective, more direct and therefore more critical way in the same return phase, following the grafting operations right from the examination of the plates through the stereoscopic eyepieces. On the other hand, the context provokes in the specialist photogrammetry and stereophotogrametry the interest in improvements through the maximum use of the optical mechanical system is that it can be said metaphorically, in this union of forces, we can fill the void behind that facade which, as has happened so far, for some reliefs, would run the risk of being considered a production by automated landscape painters of the 20th century. Page 40. It is true that following these optical mechanical applications, personalism, as it was considered fundamental in the past years, gave way to objective interpretation and moreover with the advantages previously called. The relief, however, is how if he had lost the animus and then to repurchase it. To have a closer link with the user, he must move through the way of finalizing the operations to be carried out in the vastest span of applications. In fact, a field of specialization leads as a consequence to the interest more and therefore creates a new form of personalism. The accentuation in the last few years of the problem of the conservation of cultural heritage is undoubtedly linked to the complex and widespread operations of architectural importance, especially if conservation, as is now the trend, should not be understood as Ruskinian-type freezing. However, due to the changed aesthetic and historical sociological considerations, the architectural relief is transformed from a relief of the monument, static relief, into a relief of the whole or of the environment, dynamic relief also for the multiplicity of points of view, effective all the more so if conducted through photo and stereophotogrammetric methods. The idea of a finalized survey finds its form and is justified to a greater extent when it is possible to formulate according to a classification for interventions. For example, it is possible to divide the architectural field into several themes, from the examination of the construction characteristics to those of the material used or the type of processing, or to accentuate the relief of dimensional values of the individual elements or groups of elements, all in relation to technological or historical evaluations. Furthermore, it is possible to define the survey in the field of static verification for conservative or integrative purposes, or to deal with the evaluation of deformations that have occurred over time, or finally those at the origin due to construction error or even for desired visual aberration. Particular aspect would take in the context of the finalized classification the relief of sculptural works, bas-reliefs and statues. By following this direction and moving on to a larger scale, the various relevant procedures in the spheres of the urban and suburban landscape could be clarified, placed in relation to the revitalization of the ancient centers. Blank. Page 41. An investigation of the landscape. To ascertain what exists. What can be done to document what is in extinction. Green, geomorphological changes, environment, etc. determines intact types of relief depending on whether there is an architectural, visual or psychosociological. This is certainly the field in which the automatic survey can have the most profitable applications, especially if one takes into account the times required in relation to the results. For example, the rapid survey for preliminary urban or landscape studies, which for precision, by rendering the actual dimensions, replaces the interpretative and too subjective sketch of the designer. Furthermore, these realizations must be considered as a necessary complement to the aerophotogrammetric plans, too often insufficient in the development of instruments planning. This classification system, also supplemented by degrees of precision, predetermined return scales and duration values of the operations, would also tend to set a specific limit with the client. Another point that should not be underestimated is that of the creation of a special graphism and symbolism unified in the representation of the types of architectural relief and of the environment, such as it already exists in the design type representations for the purpose of a homogeneous reading in common. In this context, the experiences of the section of the Architecture Institute of Bari are inserted, which are those of scholars who discovered the photo and strange photogrammetry in the perspective of architectural interests, and therefore different from that faced by photo and stereophotogrammetry specialists who they have identified an albeit compelling road for significant applications. The presence in Puglia of a significant monumental and environmental heritage from the XL century onwards, still to be scientifically analyzed, has prompted our interest. In particular, the castle works provoked the first experiments, given the fact that in our region, perhaps more than in the others, due to alternating histories, an architecture characterized both by different eras, differentiation of masonry interventions, and by different aesthetic trends developed and both from different functional needs, from the use of white weapons to those of fire. Everything is therefore very often found in an overlap of facts that leads to a careful analysis. Page 42. The struggles between the Byzantines and the Lombards. Between the Byzantines and the Normans. The advent of the Normans and the complex struggles between the various factions. Therefore the coming of the Swabians, the Angevins and then the Aragonese in about 5 centuries, left a set of works whose study in the sense of constructive and historical interpretations and of the breakdown of interventions is open to any research. The examination of the global dimensional facts, shape and its representation and evaluation, and of specific tacts, Ashler's dimensions, processing, additions etc. would not have been possible, nor will they be, also due to the need for an analysis by comparison with large scale without the aid of stereophotogrammetric equipment. One reason that led to take these roads was the difficulty of detecting the heights and some architectural reasons of the curtains difficult to reach, also due to the interposition of the moats and the very size of the monuments. However, an advantage was glimpsed, at least initially, due to the presence of simple lines in these monuments and the fact that the identification of only full empty relationships was sufficient both from a dimensional point of view and, according to military art, finally for the immediate determination of the inclinations of spurs and curtains. Subsequently, we were convinced that the detailed analysis of the masonry overlaps, a separation of the concretions that occurred over time, and identification of the restorations carried out was made possible only through the use of optical mechanical relief equipment. So, starting from the relief of the castle of Lecce, built on a project by Giangiacomo dell'Acciaia in 1539, the same author of Castel Sant'Elmo in Naples, that of Vecchia, also by Gian Jacopo 1535, of the castle of Copertina, by Evangelista Minga, well-known architect in the wake of Charles V, designer of part of the fortifications of Malta, 1565, and Tunis, which have served only for documentation purposes. We have come with significant improvements to the relief of the castle of Conversano, where the stereophotogrammetric, if it was not integral to all three facades, it certainly was decisive in identifying the construction details of the walls and therefore of the subsequent stratifications. Blank. Page 43. We then moved on to the survey of the castle of Bari. Norman Swabian internal nucleus 1100 to 1200, in which the overall and particular dimensional values of the masonry equipment were reported with greater precision, also because the space inside allowed shooting right distance with position of the optical axis of the phototheodolite normal to the subject. Finally we arrived at the castle of Gioia del Colle, partly Norman, partly Swabian and therefore Angevin, on which research is underway on the decomposition of the three periods and those subsequent, through an even more appropriate examination of the wall preparations up to the size of the individual elements. In the case, the two survey methods were compared, photogrammetric and stereophotogrammetric. The study of the Apulian centers could not fail to arouse interest through the stereophotogrammetric survey. In fact, documentation of the ancient center of Bari was carried out and applications of using the relief for restoration were carried out by way of example. Another intervention was conducted in Ostuni in an attempt to give certain graphic expression to the figuration of the entire town. It is, however, essential at this point, once the validity of the procedure has been ascertained, to join those who in the world and also in Italy, fearing the devastation of the cultural heritage, at the same time coveted and attacked in a strange contrast from the mass use, they proposed to intervene quickly, among other things also in evelo of graphic reading. This reading, which can be effectively constructive in the sense of a broader meaning, is desirable but requires a wide-ranging use. In essence, it is necessary to create a specialized center in our country to be entrusted to scholars of both photo-stereophotogrammetric and urbo-architectural extraction. Raffaele da Vita.